Something was wrong with the city. It had been wrong for months, in the way that things become wrong slowly, the way a crack appears in old stone, thin as a hair at first, spreading so gradually that you only notice it after the wall has already begun to lean. The wrongness was not loud. It did not announce itself. It seeped in through the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets were empty and the harbor reflected nothing but cold sodium light, and the gulls did not cry, and the fog moved in from the sea with the deliberate, unhurried patience of something that knew it had already won. Valdric noticed it first in the water. He had been standing at the edge of the old seawall for what felt like an hour, though time had always been a strange and elastic thing to him. 643 years had taught him that time did not move at a fixed pace. It pooled in certain places, it rushed in others, and in the moments before something terrible arrived, it had a way of stretching thin, like taffy pulled by invisible hands, so that each second became its own small eternity. He stood there in the dark, in the salt, stiff air, and he watched the fog coming in, and something in his ancient blood, something deeper than thought, older than language, whispered that the fog was wrong. Not the fog itself. Fog was natural. Fog had always come to this coast, rolling in from the Atlantic in gray walls that soft the edges of the city and turned the street lamps into halos and made the narrow medieval lanes feel like passages between worlds. He had watched this fog come and go for over 4 centuries, since the first stones of what would eventually become the city's old quarter had been laid by hands long since turned to dust. The fog was not wrong. What was wrong was what the fog carried. Or rather, what it did not carry. Because there was something missing in it, something that had always been present and was now absent. The way a familiar sound disappears, and you only notice its absence when the silence it leaves behind becomes too large to ignore. There was no smell. Every fog Valdric had ever known had a smell, brine and cold, and the particular organic richness of the deep ocean, the ghost of distant fishing boats, the faint mineral trace of the rocks at the base of the seawall. But this fog was odorless, perfectly, utterly odorless, as though it had been cleaned of everything that made it real. He turned from the seawall and walked back into the city. The streets of the old quarter were silent at this hour, which was 3 in the morning, which was a time that belonged to his kind the way that noon belonged to the living. He moved through the cobbled lanes with the ease of 6 centuries of practice, his footsteps making no sound on the uneven stones, his long coat absorbing the darkness around him in a way that ordinary cloth did not. He passed the shuttered fronts of restaurants and antiquarian bookshops, and the small gallery that had opened 3 years ago and would close within the year. He could already see the signs of that in the peeling gilt of the owner's name above the door, in the way the display window had gone slightly dusty. He had a talent for reading the slow decline of things. It was one of the gifts that centuries of observation bestowed on a mind patient enough to pay attention. He reached the entrance to the underground at the base of the old customs house. The entrance looked like a cellar door. It was technically a cellar door, one of thousands that dotted the old quarter, leading down into the network of storage vaults and wine cellars that honeycombed the bedrock beneath the city. Most of those cellars were perfectly ordinary. Some had been converted into restaurants or bars or private clubs. A handful were used by the city's Department of Historical Preservation for archival storage, and a very small number of them, accessed through doors that looked no different from all the others, but that bore subtle marks visible only to those who knew what they were looking for, a particular configuration of iron rivets, a specific pattern of wear on the stone threshold, led somewhere else entirely. Valdric touched his fingers to the iron ring on the door and felt the familiar cool weight of the mechanism beneath, the hidden counterbalance that made the door swing open with a pressure of 40 pounds rather than the 400 it would have taken without it. The door opened. He went down. The stairs descended for longer than the city above should have permitted. This was one of the first things that newcomers to the underground always found disorienting, the sense that they were going deeper than the physics of the place allowed, as though the underground had made a private arrangement with the laws of space that the surface world had not been informed about. Valdric had descended these stairs more times than he could count, which was not nothing, because he could count very high, and still the descent felt longer than it should, as though the stairs themselves were measuring something other than distance. At the bottom, the underground began. There was no single name for it among those who lived there. Different factions used different terms, and the terms said a great deal about the factions that used them. The oldest and most traditional communities called it simply the deep, in the way that old sailors called the ocean simply the water, a gesture of respect toward something too vast and ancient to require decoration. The more politically minded called it the covenant, after the agreements that had allowed multiple bloodlines to share the same subterranean territory for the better part of 4 centuries without destroying each other. The younger ones, those who had been turned within the last 100 years and still carried some of the modern world's fondness for branding, called it the city below, which Valdric found irritating in its literalness. He called it home. He had lived nowhere else for over 300 years. The tunnels opened into chambers, and the chambers opened into halls, and the halls opened into spaces so large that Valdric's expanded senses, which could detect a heartbeat through 6 feet of stone, had difficulty finding the far walls. The underground was not carved stone and darkness in the way that outsiders imagined when they thought of such places. It was not a dungeon. It was not a cave. It was a civilization, old, carefully maintained, sophisticated in ways that the surface world above it would have found extraordinary had the surface world ever been permitted to know about it. The architecture was a palimpsest of centuries. The oldest sections dated to the early 14th century, when the first permanent vampire community had established itself beneath what was then a small fishing harbor on the edge of a continent still reeling from plague and war. Those original chambers were narrow and low-ceilinged, hewn from the bedrock with tools that left marks still visible in the stone if you knew where to look. Not the smooth, machined surface of modern tunneling, but the irregular, almost organic texture of work done by hand, one strike at a time. In those early chambers, the stone itself felt alive. Or rather, it felt like it remembered being alive, which was close to the same thing. Beyond them, the tunnels widened into the 17th century additions, which reflected the particular aesthetic of a community that had grown prosperous and begun to think about beauty as well as survival. Here the ceilings rose and the passages were lined with pale limestone that had been brought in piece by piece over decades, fitted together with the obsessive precision of craftsmen who had centuries to perfect their work. Niches in the walls held lamps, oil in the early centuries, later converted to gas, later still to electricity of a kind that was not quite the electricity used above, but that served the same purpose with greater reliability. The lamps burned low and amber, and in their light the limestone walls glowed the color of old bone. Deeper still, the great halls. The convocation chamber, where the governing council met on nights that aligned with particular astronomical events that the council's founders had deemed significant, though no one alive, no one undead, could any longer explain why those specific events had been chosen. The Hall of Records, which occupied a space roughly the size of a tennis court and contained, in its floor-to-ceiling shelves of sealed stone compartments, the written history of every bloodline that had ever made a covenant with the underground. The feeding chambers, which were not what they sounded like, or rather, they were exactly what they sounded like, but with a precision and care that the word chamber's clinical coldness failed to capture. Valdric walked through all of it. He walked through it as he did on nights when something was troubling him deeply enough that sleep, the long, dreamless suspension that passed for sleep among his kind, was not available to him. He walked and he let the underground wash over him, the familiar weight of its history, the particular quality of its air, which was cool and slightly humid, and carried the faint mineral smell of the bedrock, and underneath that, barely perceptible, the smell that was the underground's own, ancient and complex, and unlike anything in the world above. He was trying to reassure himself. He was not succeeding. The first anomaly had occurred 8 months ago, though Valdric had not recognized it as an anomaly at the time. He had simply noted it as a curiosity and filed it in the vast metal archive, where he stored the 10,000 minor oddities that 6 centuries of observation had shown him were part of the ordinary texture of existence. A woman had come to the underground. This was not itself unusual. The underground had always maintained careful, selective contact with certain individuals in the surface world, doctors who could be trusted to ask no questions, suppliers of various materials, occasional academics who stumbled close enough to the truth that it became safer to inform them than to let them continue speculating. These relationships were managed by a small group of vampires whose entire function within the community was to serve as the interface between the underground and the city above it, and they were very good at their work. But this woman had not been brought. She had come on her own. She had found the entrance at the base of the customs house, not the obvious one that Valdric used, but a secondary entrance that was known only to members of the council and a handful of senior bloodline elders. She had descended the stairs without apparent hesitation and had walked for nearly 200 meters into the tunnel system before one of the underground sentinels had intercepted her. She had not fought. She had not run. She had stood quite calmly in the amber lamplight and looked at the sentinel with clear, steady eyes, and she had waited. The council had convened to evaluate her. Valdric had been present, sitting in his customary place at the left end of the crescent-shaped table, a position that gave him a slightly oblique angle of vision, which he preferred, because it meant he could observe both the subject of the council's attention and the council members themselves simultaneously. He had watched the woman standing before the council, and he had watched the council, and he had felt the first faint thread of something he could not immediately name. She was in her 30s by appearance, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the kind of bone structure that suggested ancestors from multiple continents, and the particular composure of someone who had spent years training themselves not to show fear in situations that warranted it. She was a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the city's university. This information had been extracted from her university ID, which she had offered voluntarily, and confirmed within minutes by members of the council with access to digital records. She specialized in the study of memory consolidation. She had published 18 papers in the last decade. Her name was Dr. Marta Vos. What she had told the council was this: she was losing her mind. Not in the way that word usually implied. She was not experiencing cognitive decline. Her faculties were entirely intact. What she was experiencing was the opposite of cognitive decline. She explained with the careful precision of a scientist, describing a phenomenon she found both fascinating and terrifying, gaining memories that did not belong to her. She was waking in the night with perfect, vivid recollections of events she had never experienced, streets she had never walked, buildings she had never entered, conversations she had never had. And beneath those intrusive memories, like a substrate running under everything else, a profound, aching sense of something lost, a feeling of having once known something vast and important, something that had been taken from her without her consent, leaving behind only the shape of its absence. She had come to the underground because the memories she was gaining, the ones that were not hers, were memories of this place. The council had listened. The council had deliberated. The council had eventually determined that Dr. Voss posed no threat and that her experience, while unusual, was likely the result of some combination of stress-induced hypnagogic states and the contamination of dream content by overheard fragments of the city's older stories. She was thanked for her candor and escorted back to the surface with a carefully applied overlay of post-hypnotic suggestion that would, the council's mind workers assured everyone, ensure she remembered the visit only as a dream. Valdric had voted with the council because the council was correct in its assessment and because he had no specific evidence to support the discomfort he felt. But he had watched Marta Voss as she was escorted out, and he had noted the way she moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who is making a conscious effort to observe and remember everything. and he had felt that discomfort settle into his chest like a stone into deep water, slow and inevitable, and not going anywhere. He had not mentioned this to anyone. There was nothing to mention. He had simply filed the memory of her in that vast internal archive and continued with his existence. Now, 8 months later, standing alone in the Hall of Records at 4 in the morning, he was taking the memory out and looking at it again. The Hall of Records was Valdric's favorite place in the underground, which was perhaps an odd preference for a being who had been, at various points in his 643 years, a soldier, a physician, a mapmaker, a spy, and a great many other things, none of which typically pointed toward archival scholarship as a primary passion. But he had been coming to this hall for over 2 centuries, and in that time it had become as familiar to him as his own reflection would have been, if he had one. The records were stored in sealed compartments of volcanic glass, a material that the underground's founders had chosen in the early 15th century for its resistance to moisture, fire, and the particular electromagnetic fields that pervaded certain sections of the tunnels, and had a tendency to degrade organic materials at an accelerated rate. Each compartment held a rolled manuscript sealed in wax, or later a bound volume, or later still a folio of typed pages, or a collection of photographs, or, in the most recent decades, a sealed digital medium of one kind or another. The compartments were organized by bloodline and chronologically within bloodline, and the system was maintained by a rotating group of archivist scholars whose work was considered among the most important in the underground's economy of rolls. Valdric had spent weeks in this hall after events that troubled him. After the Second World War, during which the underground had lost nearly 40 members to a combination of circumstance and the catastrophic disruption of surface life that had made selective invisible feeding nearly impossible for several years. After the death of Sarah Fiel, who had been the oldest member of the underground for 3 centuries before her end, and whose absence had left a gap in the community's collective memory that felt still, nearly 2 centuries later, like a missing tooth. After his own periodic crises of purpose, which came roughly every 50 years and lasted until he talked himself back into the conviction that 6 centuries of survival implied something worth surviving for. Tonight he was in the hall for a different reason. He was looking for something that should have been there and was not. The records of the Christian bloodline occupied 17 compartments in the 3rd row from the top on the eastern wall. Valdric knew this because he had been present when the first of those 17 compartments had been sealed, in the autumn of 1724, and he had been present for the sealing of most of the subsequent ones. He knew the Christian records the way he knew the underground's geography, not by active effort, but by the accumulated weight of centuries of familiarity. 3 compartments were empty, not missing, not broken or opened or tampered with in any visible way, simply empty. The volcanic glass of the compartments was intact, the seals at their edges were unbroken. But when Valdric opened them, using the combination of pressure points that unlocked the seal without disturbing it, a technique he had been taught by the archivist who had installed the system nearly 100 years ago, the compartments contained nothing. Not blank pages or deteriorated materials, nothing. Clean, empty space, as though the contents had never existed. He stood looking at the empty compartments for a long time. Then he very carefully closed them and sat down on the stone bench that ran along the base of the eastern wall, and he placed both hands flat on the cool stone, and he thought. The 3 compartments had contained the records of the Christian bloodline from the years 1891 through 1923, 32 years of history. He knew this because he remembered reading those records, could call up specific details from them with the clarity that his kind of memory possessed. The detailed account of the Christian elder Prosper's navigation of the city's early industrial expansion, the careful documentation of feeding adjustments made necessary by the installation of electric street lighting, the records of the community's response to the influenza pandemic of 1918, which had created both challenges and opportunities that were discussed with the dispassionate pragmatism that centuries of necessity had bred into the underground's leadership. He could remember reading these things. He could see the pages in his mind with perfect clarity, the particular handwriting of the archivist who had compiled them, the texture of the paper. The records existed in his memory. They did not exist in the compartments. Something had taken them. Not physically. The compartments were undamaged, the seals unbroken. Something had taken them in a way that left no physical trace. Something had reached into the sealed glass vessels and removed 32 years of history as cleanly and completely as drawing breath out of a closed room. Valdric sat very still for a very long time. Then he stood, replaced the empty compartments, and went to find Sethi. Sethi was the current head of the Underground's council, a position she had held for 40 years, and that suited her in the way that positions of sustained authority suit people who are not interested in power for its own sake, but who are so clearly and obviously competent that power finds them whether they want it or not. She was approximately 400 years old. The exact year of her turning was a matter of some historical ambiguity that she herself found mildly amusing, and she had the particular quality of stillness that came with genuine age, the sense that she was observing the present moment from a position slightly removed from it, the way a person on a hillside can see more of a road than someone walking on it. She was not asleep when Valdric knocked at the entrance to her chamber. She had not been asleep. When she opened the door and looked at him, he could see in her expression that she had been waiting for something, and that she was not entirely certain whether his arrival at her door at 4 in the morning was that something or merely adjacent to it. He told her about the empty compartments. She listened without expression, which was not the same as listening without reaction. He knew her well enough to read the subtle tightening around her eyes that meant what she was hearing was not welcome. When he had finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that 2 weeks ago, the council had received reports from 3 separate members of the feeding network that their human contacts, the individuals with whom they maintained long-term, carefully managed relationships of the kind that allowed for regular, undetectable feeding, had expressed no recognition when approached. Not fear, not suspicion, simply no recognition. As though the relationship that had been built and maintained over years or decades had simply ceased to exist in their memories. This had been attributed to various causes: stress, illness, the occasional human who, for reasons of individual neurology, proved less susceptible to the memory management techniques that the Underground used to maintain the invisibility of its feeding operations. The reports had been noted and the affected relationships had been discontinued as a precaution. No further investigation had been initiated. Valdric asked whether the council had considered that these events might be connected. Sethi looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that he had always found slightly unsettling, because they were the eyes of someone who was very good at sitting with uncomfortable possibilities. She said that the council had considered it. She said that the council had decided the evidence was insufficient to support any specific theory of connection. She said, with a directness that he appreciated even as he recognized it was also a kind of door closing, that the council would continue to monitor the situation. He asked about Marta Voss. Setha's stillness changed slightly. It was a change he might not have noticed if he had not known her for 2 centuries. She said that Dr. Voss had been re-evaluated 2 months ago, following a second unannounced appearance at one of the Underground's secondary entrances. The post-hypnotic overlay applied after her first visit had apparently failed to take, or had been degraded by something. The council had applied a stronger version and returned her to the surface. She had not reappeared since. Valdric filed this information carefully. Then he thanked Sethi and returned to his own chamber, and he lay down on the long stone platform that served as his bed, and he looked at the ceiling in the low amber light, and he thought about empty compartments and odorless fog and a neuroscientist whose carefully managed memories kept reasserting themselves. He thought about it for the remainder of the night. When the day came, felt rather than seen, the subtle shift in the Underground's ambient quality that corresponded to sunrise above, he was not closer to an answer, but he was closer to a question. And the question was this: if something was feeding on memory, was it feeding selectively or was it simply feeding? And if it was feeding selectively, what was it selecting? And if it was not, if it was feeding indiscriminately, consuming whatever was nearest, then how long before it consumed something that could not be replaced? Sleep did not come until much later, and when it did, it was thin and troubled, and he dreamed of fog. The underground's feeding system had been refined over 4 centuries into something of genuine elegance. Elegance was not too strong a word. What the founders had established as a brutal and dangerous necessity, the relationship between predator and prey dressed up in necessity rather than beauty, had been transformed by time and intelligence and the particular pressure that invisibility places on those who must be invisible into something that was, if not beautiful, at least artful in the way that highly functional systems often are. The principle was simple, and it was the same principle that had governed the underground's survival since its establishment. Take nothing that cannot be quietly replaced. Feed selectively. Maintain contact with a small number of humans over extended periods rather than ranging widely across the population. Apply, consistently and carefully, the memory adjustments that prevented those humans from accumulating a coherent understanding of what was happening to them. And above all, never cause permanent harm. This last principle was not purely ethical, though some members of the underground had ethical reasons for adhering to it. Reasons that had evolved over centuries of living in close proximity to humanity in ways that stripped away the convenient abstraction of the prey category. It was primarily practical. Permanent harm attracted attention. Attention threatened everything. The underground had survived for as long as it had not because it was powerful, but because it was invisible. And invisibility, once compromised, was extraordinarily difficult to restore. The memory adjustments were the linchpin of the system. They had been developed over generations by the undergrounds, mind workers, practitioners of the particular discipline that the underground's founding bloodlines had called the inner craft, a set of techniques for influencing the perceptions and memories of humans through sustained close contact and the application of specific biological compounds that the vampire physiology produced naturally. Over centuries, the techniques had been refined to the point where a skilled mind worker could adjust a human's memory of an encounter with the precision of a surgeon, removing or softening specific recollections while leaving the surrounding cognitive fabric undisturbed. The process was not foolproof. There were individuals whose neurology resisted the techniques, just as there were individuals whose immune systems resisted certain pathogens. There was also a recognized risk of cumulative degradation. The repeated application of memory adjustments to the same individual over long periods could, if not performed with great care, begin to affect the general texture of memory function rather than just the targeted recollections. This was considered the most serious potential harm of the feeding system, and the underground's protocols included extensive guidelines for monitoring the cumulative effects of adjustment in long-term contacts. Valdric had been thinking about these protocols in the days since his conversation with Sethi, and about what it would mean if something external were interfering with them. Not a failure of technique, not the ordinary variation in human neurology that the protocols already accounted for, but a genuine external force, something that was doing to human memory what the underground's mind workers did, but without the care, without the precision, without the protocols. Something that was simply reaching in and taking. He had begun, quietly and without informing the council, conducting his own investigation. He started with the records. The Hall of Records, the 3 empty question compartments, which he returned to 3 more times over the course of the following week. Each time, he examined not just the empty compartments, but the ones around them, checking for any signs of disturbance, any change in the quality of the seal or the integrity of the volcanic glass. He found nothing. The compartments were exactly as he had found them the first time, empty, undamaged, as though the records they had contained had been gently breathed away. He also pulled the records from adjacent bloodlines for the same period, 1891 through 1923, and read them with the attention he brought to anything he considered potentially dangerous. He was looking for any reference to events or individuals who might be connected to the erasure. He found nothing that seemed directly relevant, but he found something that nagged at him in the way that details without apparent significance often did when they were, in fact, significant. In the spring of 1917, the records of the Melnarus bloodline mentioned in passing that a visiting member of an Eastern European community had spent 3 months in the underground and had departed without explanation. The member's name was not recorded, which was itself unusual. The underground's record-keeping was meticulous precisely because the preservation of names was considered both practical and, in a community of the undying, something approaching sacred. A name not recorded was a choice, not an omission. He noted this and moved on. He turned his attention to the surface world, to the city above. He began moving through it differently, not the purposeful, destination-oriented movement of his usual nights, but a slower, more expansive kind of attention, the kind he had used in the field as a mapmaker in the 16th century, when the assignment was not to travel between 2 known points, but to understand the entire shape of an unknown territory. He walked the old quarter and the waterfront and the new districts that had been built over former industrial zones in the past 20 years, and he observed the people of the city with the focused attention of 6 centuries of watching human beings be human beings. What he was looking for was the particular behavioral signature of memory disruption. He recognized it because the underground's feeding system, carefully applied, produced a mild version of it. A slight distractedness in the hours after an encounter, a tendency toward the middle distance, a faint quality of searching that the individual was not consciously aware of, but that was visible to a trained eye in the way they oriented themselves in space. The underground's mind workers called it the drift, and it was considered one of the acceptable minor costs of the system, a cost that dissipated naturally within a day or two and left no permanent trace. What Valdric was seeing in the streets of the city was not the drift. It was something else. Something that used the same vocabulary, the same distractedness, the same searching quality, but at a scale and intensity that the underground's techniques had never produced and never intended to produce. He saw it in a man sitting on a bench in the waterfront park, staring at the harbor with an expression of profound disorientation, as though the familiar geography of the place had somehow failed to align with his expectations of it. He saw it in a group of women outside a cafe who spoke to each other with the slightly stilted quality of people constructing conversation from fragments, filling in the gaps between remembered facts with improvised continuity. He saw it in a child, which was the one that made his jaw tighten, because the underground's protocols absolutely forbade any contact with children, standing outside a school at the end of the day, not moving, not looking for a parent, simply standing with an expression of perfect blankness that should not have been on a child's face. He observed. He documented in the meticulous mental shorthand that centuries of practice had made second nature. He did not intervene, because intervention in individual cases was not what was needed. What was needed was a clear picture of scale, distribution, and pattern. He forced himself to be patient, to be a scientist of the catastrophe rather than a participant in it. After 2 weeks, he had his picture. The memory disruptions were concentrated in 3 distinct areas of the city. The old quarter, particularly its oldest streets, the ones that ran closest to the underground's entrances. The waterfront, from the old fish market at the northern end to the redeveloped docklands at the south. And a newer residential district to the east of the city center that Valdric had no obvious reason to associate with the underground, but that he was beginning to suspect had some connection he had not yet identified. The disruptions were not uniform. They seemed to scale with something, density of population, or proximity to something specific, or some other variable he had not yet isolated. In some blocks, the effect was mild enough that he might have missed it if he had not been looking. In others, it was severe enough that he found himself, more than once, watching people struggle to hold the thread of a simple transaction, buying coffee, paying a parking meter, navigating a familiar intersection, as though the task required the construction of a small piece of the world from scratch, because the memory of how to do it had gone. He stood in the middle of one of those severely affected streets on a Tuesday night, surrounded by the soft, struggling confusion of a dozen people who did not know what was wrong with them. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something that took him a moment to identify. Not fear. He had made a complicated peace with fear over the centuries. Not anger, though that was present too, a low, slow anger at whatever was doing this. What he felt, standing in that street, was grief. Not for the humans, though grief was present there too, underneath everything. He felt grief for the fundamental nature of what was being lost. Because memory was not simply a record, memory was the substance of a self. It was the ongoing narrative that transformed the sequence of moments into a life, that gave the present context and the future shape. To take memory was not to steal property. It was to dismantle a person from the inside, quietly, without their knowledge, until what remained was a walking form, without the animating thread that had made it a particular, irreplaceable self. He knew this with a certainty that went beyond intellectual understanding, because he had spent 643 years studying the texture of his own memory, the way it worked differently from human memory, the ways it was the same. He had lost things from memory over the centuries, the natural attrition of time working on even the most durable mind, and he knew what that loss felt like from the inside, the sudden gap where a face had been, the name that had been perfectly clear yesterday and was today inaccessible, the whole decades that had faded into a diffuse impression rather than a sequence of remembered events. He had learned to grieve these losses without being destroyed by them, but he had never experienced the loss of memory as something imposed from outside. He had never had it taken, and now something was taking it, from humans, yes, but he had a feeling, a cold, deepening feeling that settled in the hollows of his ancient bones, that the humans were not the only ones being depleted. He thought of the empty compartments in the Hall of Records. He thought of the mind workers whose post-hypnotic overlays had failed to take or had been eroded. He thought of the visiting member from 1917 whose name had not been recorded. He went back underground. The council met 6 times a year under normal circumstances, on nights determined by the astronomical calendar established by the founders. Under extraordinary circumstances, the council could be convened at any time by a majority request from its members, or by the unanimous request of the senior elders, of whom there were currently 4. Valdric was one of the 4. He had never, in 200 years of council membership, exercised his right to request an emergency convening unilaterally. He exercised it now. The council met in the convocation chamber 4 nights later. Sethi sat at the center of the crescent table, her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who has been expecting a difficult conversation and has spent the intervening time preparing for it. The other 7 council members arranged themselves with varying degrees of wariness. Valdric took his customary seat at the left end and placed his documentation, a manuscript of 93 pages he had written in the past 2 weeks, at the center of the table. The manuscript contained everything he had observed. The empty compartments in the Hall of Records, the scale and distribution of the memory disruptions in the city above, the behavioral patterns he had documented, the preliminary analysis of the 3 affected districts, and their relationship to the underground's known infrastructure. He had written it with the meticulous care of a physician documenting an outbreak, which was, he had come to believe, the most useful frame for understanding what was happening. He watched the council read it. He watched Setha's expression move through several phases, none of which were entirely reassuring. When the council had finished reading, the discussion that followed was long and difficult and revealed, as difficult discussions in close communities often do, the fault lines that existed beneath the community's surface coherence. The younger council members, those turned within the last 2 centuries, were inclined toward a more aggressive response. They wanted to close certain surface access points, suspend the feeding network while an investigation was conducted, increase patrol activity in the tunnels. These were the responses of people whose primary experience of threat was confrontational, who had been shaped by the world they entered before joining the underground, a world in which threats were addressed by direct action. The older members were more restrained, and their restraint came not from complacency, but from the specific knowledge that centuries of caution had embedded in them. The knowledge that aggressive responses to poorly understood situations had historically been among the most reliable ways to make poorly understood situations much worse. Sevi spoke very little during the discussion. She was doing what she always did in large group deliberations, listening for the thing that was not being said. What was not being said, what Valdric was waiting for someone to say, knowing that if he said it himself, it would be received with more resistance than if it emerged from the group, was the obvious implication of the empty compartments. If the memory disruptions in the city above were connected to the disappearance of records from the Hall of Records, then the entity doing this was not operating solely in the human population. It was operating in the underground as well. The humans were not the primary target. Or if they were the primary target, the underground was at minimum collateral damage, and in a community as small and as dependent on institutional memory as this one, collateral damage of this nature was not a minor concern. After 2 hours of discussion, it was Narration, one of the council's oldest members, a figure of such profound stillness that her presence in a room often went unnoticed until she spoke, who finally said it. She said it calmly, in the flat, precise language of someone who has thought a thing through so completely that the saying of it is almost redundant. She said that the evidence presented suggested the possibility of a predatory entity whose feeding substrate was not blood but memory, and that if this were the case, the implications for the underground were not secondary but primary, because a civilization built on the preservation and transmission of accumulated knowledge was uniquely vulnerable to a predator of that kind. The chamber was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. Then the arguments began, and they were the arguments that communities always make when confronted with evidence of a threat they cannot immediately resolve. Not enough evidence, too many alternative explanations, the risk of overreacting to an ambiguous situation, the history of false alarms. Valdric listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has heard every version of the argument across 6 centuries of emergencies, and who knows that the arguing is not obstruction but process, the necessary working through of resistance that precedes genuine reckoning. He let them argue. He waited. The council voted, ultimately, to authorize a formal investigation under Valdric's direction with a mandate to report back within 60 days. It also authorized a precautionary partial suspension of the feeding network in the 3 affected districts, which the feeding network's administrators would later describe as the most disruptive operational decision made in the underground's modern history. Valdric accepted both mandates without comment. On his way out of the convocation chamber, he paused beside Narration, who was still sitting at the table, looking at the 93-page manuscript with an expression he could not entirely read. He asked her what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about the 1917 records. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Between 2 people who had each lived for centuries, a shared recognition could pass without words and without any further elaboration, the way very old friends sometimes communicate in a language assembled from decades of shared context. He said nothing. She said nothing. He left the chamber. The investigation began in the Hall of Records, because the Hall of Records was where the evidence was most concrete and most historically legible, and because Valdric believed, with the methodological instinct of a scientist who had been practicing science since before the word had its current meaning, that you always started with what you could touch. He spent 3 weeks reading everything the hall contained from the period 1890 to 1930, working systematically from bloodline to bloodline, noting every reference to unusual events, unidentified individuals, behavioral anomalies, memory disturbances. He read with the full attention of 6 centuries of accumulated interpretive capacity, letting the documents speak to him the way old documents always did when you gave them the time they deserved. not just conveying their explicit content, but revealing in the gaps and elisions and carefully chosen silences the things that had been considered too dangerous or too uncertain to say directly. The picture that assembled itself from this reading was fragmentary, because records from that period were inevitably incomplete, but it had a shape. Between 1912 and 1919, multiple bloodlines had documented incidents of what they called unexplained forgetting among their human contacts. Contacts who had, without apparent cause, lost specific memories of encounters with the Underground's members. At the time, this had been attributed to the massive social disruption of the First World War, which had produced profound psychological effects in the human population that the Underground's mind workers had found genuinely disruptive to their work. The interpretation was plausible. It was also, Valdric now believed, wrong. Because alongside these human incidents, several records made oblique references to something internal. A community member in Berlin who had, over the course of a year, lost the ability to recall the names of people he had known for decades. Another in Vienna who had retired from the feeding network after reporting that she could no longer form new memories, with the precision she had maintained for over 2 centuries, that her new experiences were failing to consolidate with the crystalline permanence that was one of the defining characteristics of vampire cognition. These reports had been evaluated at the time as cases of individual psychological deterioration, something that occurred occasionally in the very old, a kind of gentle dissolution that the community had learned to recognize and accommodate with care. Now reading them in sequence, in the context of everything he had observed in the past weeks, they looked like something else entirely. He wrote a summary of his findings, 60 pages that he kept in a locked volcanic glass compartment he had set aside for his own use in a section of the hall that few others frequented. Then he sat with the summary for several nights, reading it and rereading it, testing its logic, looking for the places where he was building on inference rather than evidence and marking those places clearly so that he could argue his conclusions without claiming more certainty than the evidence supported. He was building a portrait of something new, or rather, something new-ish, something that seemed to have appeared once before, roughly a century ago, and had then disappeared, or been contained, or had simply moved on, and was now appearing again. The question was what it was, and the question under that question, the one that pressed against the walls of his thinking with increasing urgency, was whether it was a predator, an external entity that had arrived from somewhere else and was feeding on the Underground, or whether it was something that had emerged from the Underground itself, something internal, something that had evolved. He thought about evolution. He had been alive long enough to observe it, not just in the abstract sense of knowing that species changed over generations, but in the concrete, personal sense of having watched things change within populations he was part of. The Underground was not a static community. 4 centuries of adaptive pressure, the need to remain invisible, to manage complex human relationships, to feed sustainably from a finite population in a bounded geographic area, had shaped its members in ways that their founders would not entirely have recognized. The mind workers were the most obvious example. The ability to adjust human memory had existed in nascent form in the founding bloodlines, but the particular sophistication it had reached in the current generation was the product of centuries of selective development, of individuals with particular talents finding each other, building on each other's capacity, refining the techniques and passing them to the next generation. What if the refinement had continued past the point anyone had intended? What if, under the sustained pressure of the Underground's particular ecology, something in the cognitive machinery of the mind workers had mutated, had developed past the ability to adjust memory into the ability to consume it? And what if that new capacity, once established, produced not just a new ability but a new need, not blood but memory, not the biological substrate, but the cognitive one, the accumulated experience that vampires stored with such extraordinary fidelity and that humans produced with such extraordinary richness? He sat with this possibility for a long time. It had the particular texture of ideas that are true, not the satisfying click of an elegant theory, but the more uncomfortable quality of something that explains too much, that connects too many things you had hoped were unconnected. He thought about the member whose name had not been recorded in 1917. He thought about Marta Voss, waking with memories of a place she had never been. He thought about the 3 empty compartments in the Hall of Records. He thought about what kind of being could take records out of a sealed container without breaking the seal. He thought about the mind workers, and about the difference between adjusting memory and consuming it, and about the thin line between a tool and a weapon, and about how often, in the history of his own long existence, the distance between the two had turned out to be shorter than anyone had expected. He decided to find one. This decision was made not with any particular sense of drama, but with the quiet, functional decisiveness that Valdric had developed over centuries of dealing with situations in which there was no good option, only less bad ones. He was aware that finding a memory feeder, as he had begun thinking of them in his private mental shorthand, was potentially dangerous in a way that was qualitatively different from the ordinary dangers of his existence. If these beings fed on memory, then approaching one was approaching a predator that could harm him in the one way his physiology had no defense against, not by damaging his body, which could recover from almost anything, but by reaching into the vast archive of his mind and simply taking from it. He found this prospect genuinely terrifying. He had not been genuinely terrified of something in a very long time. The strategy he developed was built on careful observation rather than direct approach. He would not go looking for a memory feeder. He would look for the traces they left, the way a naturalist tracks an unknown animal, not by pursuing it directly, but by learning the signs of its passage, the altered landscape, the disturbed behavior of other organisms, the particular quality of the damage it leaves behind. He began spending his nights in the 3 affected districts of the city, moving slowly through them, watching. He was watching for the same behavioral signatures he had observed earlier, but now with a more specific focus, looking not for the effects on the human population, but for the source of those effects. He was looking for the still point at the center of the disturbance, the eye of the particular storm. It took 11 nights. On the 11th night, in the narrow lane that ran behind the old fish market, he found the quality of space he was looking for. He would have struggled to describe it precisely. It was not visual. There was nothing to see, no figure, no unusual light, nothing that could have been captured in a photograph. It was more like a property of the air, a slight increase in the density of the atmosphere, a sense of being in a place where things were being drawn rather than expelled. He had stood on docks waiting for ships to dock and felt the water behaving differently, drawn toward the displacement of the approaching hull before anything was visible on the horizon. It felt like that. He stood very still. He breathed, though he did not need to. He let his awareness extend outward, through the range of his senses, which reached considerably further than human senses did, and he searched the quality of the air around him for its source. And then, at the edge of his perception, he found it. Not it, them. There were 2 of them, standing at the far end of the lane in the deep shadow of the market's back wall. And they were. He searched for the right word, because the word he wanted did not quite exist. They were feeding. Not with any visible mechanism. Not with the direct physical contact that the underground's own feeding required. They were simply standing there, still as stones, and the air around them had that quality of drawing that he had felt before, and at the edges of it, barely perceptible, was the faintest trace of something leaving, a quality of departure, of thinning, of things becoming less. He watched for a long time. He was very careful not to move, not to disturb the air between them. He made himself smaller in his own awareness, pulling his presence in, reducing the signal of his existence to the minimum. He had learned this technique in the 15th century, and it had served him well in a great many situations, and he was grateful for it now in a way he had rarely been grateful for anything. What he observed over the hour he stood there was this: 2 individuals who appeared, in all external respects, to be ordinary members of the underground. They were dressed as the underground's members dressed. Practical, dark clothing, unobtrusive, of good quality without being conspicuous. Their manner was calm and deliberate. They were not performing any visible action. They were standing, and they were not quite visible in the way that his kind were often not quite visible, the subtle refusal to be fully present that made humans' eyes slide over them without registering them. But the air was different around them. The drawing quality was real. And when a man walked through the lane, someone coming from the market district to the residential streets beyond, a perfectly ordinary person going about his ordinary late-night business, Valdric watched the quality intensify slightly as he passed, and then he watched the man 20 meters further on stop and look around with the confused, searching expression of someone who has momentarily lost the thread of where he is and where he was going. The man stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then, with the visible effort of someone pulling themselves back from the edge of something, he found his direction and continued walking. The two figures at the end of the lane did not move. But Valdric felt, at the edge of his extended awareness, the very faint quality of satisfaction that is not emotional but metabolic, the specific quality of a thing that has been fed. He stayed until the two figures departed, which they did after another 40 minutes, moving with the unhurried quiet of beings who had no need to hurry. He followed them. He was very careful. He kept his distance. He tracked them through the old quarter and down through one of the secondary tunnel entrances, not his entrance, but one he knew, and the recognition of the entrance, the confirmation that they were going underground, landed in his chest like cold water. He did not follow them further. He had enough. He went back to his own chamber and sat with what he had seen, and he thought about what it meant that the two figures had been members of the underground, not outsiders, not something that had arrived from elsewhere and could be expelled. Members, his kind. He thought about the thin line between a tool and a weapon. He thought about refinement continuing past the point anyone had intended. He thought about evolution, and about the specific pressures the underground's ecology had created, and about what happened to a community when one of its adaptive traits overshot. He thought about the empty compartments, and about the records of 1917, and about the member whose name had not been recorded. He thought about the fact that the member whose name had not been recorded had visited the underground and then departed without explanation, and the records of the following year had documented the first known cases of unexplained forgetting among the underground's human contacts. Something had visited in 1917 and left something behind. A capacity, a strain, a new way of being what they were, passed between members of the community, the way any adaptive trait passes, slowly, quietly, through proximity and contact, through the invisible inheritance of shared blood and the shared cognitive substrate that the underground's communal feeding practices had, over centuries, established. And for a century, that capacity had been dormant, or had been present only in forms too subtle to detect, or had been present and suppressed by social norms whose function had not been recognized until now. Until something had changed, pressure, population, some critical threshold of proximity or accumulated change, and the capacity had woken up and begun to express itself, and the beings in whom it had expressed itself had not destroyed themselves or transformed dramatically. They were still there, still walking through the underground's corridors, still attending to whatever functions they serve in the community's economy of roles, still feeding, just differently. He wrote a second summary, 68 pages, and locked it in the same compartment as the first. Then he sat and thought about what to bring to the council, and how to say it, and what the council would do, and what the underground would do, and what any of them could do in the face of something that was not an external threat, but an internal one, not an invasion, but an evolution. He thought about these things for a very long time. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only the very old understand, not the loneliness of isolation, which is the kind most people know, but the loneliness of continuity, the loneliness of having lasted long enough that the world has changed around you so many times that the version of yourself you were when you began is not just distant, but, in some fundamental way, unavailable. You cannot go back to it. You cannot even fully remember it, not in the way it actually was. You can only remember your memories of it, which are themselves memories of memories, copies of copies, worn smooth by repetition into something that resembles the original without being it. Valdric had started thinking about this kind of loneliness more often in recent weeks, and he recognized the tendency as a symptom, not of anything pathological, simply of the particular state he was in, the state of reckoning with something that was not yet fully understood, but that was already beginning to feel, in its implications, enormous. He had been 6 years old when he was born, in a town and a country that no longer existed under that name, in a century that felt, from this side of 600 years, like something out of a story told about someone else. He had been a child who listened. He could remember, or remembered remembering, the quality of the air in the house where he had grown up, the sound of certain voices, the particular weight of a specific season. He could remember very little else from that time. The first century of his undeath was clearer, and the second clearer still. And from the 4th century onward, his memory was essentially perfect. The crystalline retention that was one of the defining characteristics of what he was. Perfect, and now threatened. He thought about what it meant to lose memory when you were immortal. For a human, memory loss was tragic but finite. The life that was lost was finite, and so the loss, while real and deep, had a boundary. For a vampire, the stakes were different. His memory was not a record of a life that would eventually end. It was the life. 643 years of experience, accumulated with perfect fidelity, was not background, it was everything. It was the substance of what he was. Strip it away, and what remained would not be him in any meaningful sense. It would be a vessel, possessing all his physical characteristics, all the adaptations and capacities of his ancient physiology, but empty of the accumulated self that those 643 years had made. The memory feeders, he now believed, understood this. They were not taking human memories because human memories were more valuable. Human memories were the practice ground, the easy sustenance, the way a predator that can hunt large game will nonetheless begin with smaller, easier prey. What they would eventually want, what they were already reaching for, in the way that the empty compartments in the Hall of Records suggested, was older, richer, more dense. Memory accumulated over centuries rather than decades. The vast sediment-layered archives of the very old. Memories like his. He was, he realized, probably already being watched. Perhaps already being fed from, in increments too small to detect consciously. He spent several nights conducting what he thought of as an internal audit. A careful survey of his own memory, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, the telltale signs of removal. He found nothing obvious, but the absence of obvious signs was not reassuring in the way it should have been, because a sufficiently skilled feeder would not leave obvious signs. The skill was presumably in the taking without the mark. He thought about the mind workers again, the underground's most skilled memory practitioners, the ones whose ability to reach into human cognition and adjust it with surgical precision had been the linchpin of the underground survival system for 4 centuries. What would it mean if the same capacity that had been developed for adjustment had been repurposed, by evolution, by accident, by the slow drift of a trait under new selective pressures, for consumption? It would mean that the most skilled among them were the most dangerous. It would mean that the beings best equipped to conceal what they were doing were precisely the ones doing it. It would mean that the underground's greatest asset had become its greatest vulnerability, and had been that for some time, and no one had seen it because no one had been looking for it, and no one had been looking for it because it was the kind of threat that was psychologically very difficult to look for, the kind that comes not from outside, but from within. He brought this to the council. The second meeting was harder than the first. Sevi listened to everything. She read the summaries, both of them. She asked 3 questions, each of which cut directly to the most uncertain claims in his analysis, and his answers to all 3 were versions of the same answer, which was that he was working from partial evidence, and the conclusions were probable rather than certain. She accepted this with the same equanimity with which she accepted everything. Then she told the council. The council's reaction divided along lines that Valdric had anticipated, but hoped would not be as sharp. There was a faction that wanted to treat the identified memory feeders as a contamination to be isolated and removed, the language of infection that communities often reach for when confronting internal deviation. There was a faction that wanted more evidence before any action, because the threshold for acting against community members was high and should be high, and Valdric's evidence, while compelling, was not definitive. There was a smaller third faction, anchored by Marate, that was asking a different kind of question entirely. Not what to do about the identified individuals, but what to do about the capacity itself, which existed in the community as a latent possibility, regardless of how many individuals currently expressed it. This third faction's question was the one that haunted Valdric most, because the answer to what to do about the capacity was not obvious in the way that the answers to the other questions were at least superficially obvious. A capacity that had evolved in the community could not be simply excised. It was not a foreign body. It was an expression of something that was already there. And the individuals in whom it had fully emerged were not monsters, or rather, if they were monsters, they were monsters of the same kind that the entire community was, the kind made by centuries of surviving at the cost of other beings' well-being. The difference was one of method and degree, and crucially, visibility. The underground standard feeding practices were visible to those who designed and administered them, were governed by protocols and oversight, were considered acceptable because of the care taken to minimize harm. The memory feeders were invisible in the system. They were ungoverned. They were taking without protocol. But the capacity itself was not inherently different from what the mind workers had always done. It was the same faculty, the same biological substrate, operating without constraint. The monster and the doctor were closer than anyone had wanted to believe. The council met 3 times over the following month, and each meeting was longer and more difficult than the one before. The external evidence kept coming in, more memory disruptions in the city above, more affected districts, the first reports of individuals who had lost not just specific memories, but entire periods, years of their lives gone as though they had never been. And with the external evidence came the internal, the things that the records investigation was beginning to turn up, the slowly accumulating picture of a community quietly hollowing itself from within. 2 of the underground's senior mind workers were placed under voluntary monitoring. Another 3 were observed without their knowledge. The underground's feeding network was suspended entirely in the affected districts and significantly curtailed elsewhere. The Hall of Records was locked to all but council members and the investigation team. These measures were implemented with the difficulty that all communities face when implementing restrictions on their own members, which is to say, imperfectly, with resistance, with the particular bitterness of a place that had always prided itself on the covenant that held it together, finding that covenant unable to hold. And in the middle of all of this, Marta Vuss appeared at the entrance to the underground for the 3rd time. She had not come through the secondary entrance this time. She had come through the primary one, Valdric's entrance, at the base of the customs house, and she had descended not the 30 meters to the first tunnel intersection, but the full 200 to the level of the Hall of Records. She had walked there directly, without hesitation, in complete darkness. One of the council's monitoring teams had been in the hall when she arrived. They had watched her enter without any apparent awareness of being observed, and they had watched her stop in the center of the hall and stand there in the amber light of the low-burning lamps, looking around at the walls of sealed compartments with an expression that the monitoring team's report described as recognition. Not the recognition of a place seen for the first time and matching an expectation. The recognition of a place known intimately, returned to after a long absence. They had contacted Valdric, and Valdric had come, and he had stood in the Hall of Records, and looked at Marta Voss, and she had looked at him. And for a moment, one of those moments that 6 centuries of existence occasionally delivered, strange and freighted and impossible to prepare for, he had the uncanny sensation of being recognized by someone he had never met. This time, at his request, the council did not apply post-hypnotic adjustment. This time they simply watched. What Dr. Voss said to the council, or rather what she said to Valdric, because the council had ceded the conversation to him by unspoken agreement, was delivered in the careful, precise language of a scientist who is aware that the territory she's describing is outside the available maps. She had, she explained, been documenting her own memory disruptions for 8 months. She had not been experiencing the gradual loss that the underground's affected human contacts were reporting. She was experiencing the opposite. She was accumulating foreign memories, arriving unbidden and consolidating with the same permanence as her own. And in the past month, as the accumulation had accelerated, a pattern had emerged in the foreign memories that she had spent 2 weeks analyzing with the full apparatus of her professional expertise. The pattern was this: the memories she was receiving were not random, they were filtered. And the filter appeared to correspond to emotional density. She was receiving memories of high emotional weight, memories of loss and grief and profound connection, memories that contained, in psychological terms, the highest concentration of what she would call self-defining content. The memories that made a person who they were, rather than simply what they had done. She had come, she said, because the analysis of the filter had led her to a hypothesis she could not test alone. The hypothesis was that the memory feeders were not taking indiscriminately. They were taking selectively, and what they were selecting for was not just any memory but identity. They were consuming the self. And the memories were going somewhere. Not simply disappearing. She was receiving them, fragmentary and out of context, but arriving nonetheless, like signals from a very distant transmitter. Which meant that if the memories were going somewhere, there was a somewhere for them to go. And that somewhere was not in the people being fed from. And it was not in the feeders, because she had, through the particular kind of methodological courage that had earned her 18 published papers in a decade, conducted a series of self-experiments with memory consolidation techniques from her research, applying them to the foreign memories she was accumulating, and the cognitive signature of the memories she received did not match the cognitive signature she would expect from a predator storing its prey's experience. The memories arrived as though they had been passed through something, not stored in it. As though they were in transit. Valdric sat with this for a long time. The council was very quiet. He asked her what she thought was at the end of the transit. She said she did not know. But she said that the quality of arrival, the way the foreign memories reached her, the texture of how they consolidated, was consistent with the properties of a system that was being rooted. Not taken and held, but taken and redirected. Passed along to something that was not in the city. Something that was, as best as her analysis could determine, at a considerable remove from the present moment. The silence in the Hall of Records after she said this was the longest Valdric could remember. He thought about the odorless fog. He thought about the drawer of his own history that had been quietly pulled open and examined while he slept. He thought about what it might mean for the memories being taken to be in transit, to be passing through the feeders rather than to them, toward a destination elsewhere. He thought about the nature of the memory feeders and whether the word predator was still the right word, if they were not accumulating for themselves, but collecting for another. He thought about the word servants. He thought about something very old, something that had existed before the underground, before the community, before the covenant, before all the careful, patient work of survival that 6 centuries had built. Something that had learned, somewhere in the long history of the world, that memory was the richest and most permanent form of sustenance there was. Not blood, which was temporary, which flowed and dried and was replenished, which was a renewable resource because the bodies that made it were finite and replaceable, not the brief warmth of a human life. But memory, centuries of it, millennia perhaps. The accumulated interior lives of thousands of beings, each one carrying within them the entire history of their own continuous experience, irreplaceable and dense with the particular richness of a self that is kept going. Something old enough to know that the best prey was the kind that generated its own value over time. The days that followed, and here the measurement of time becomes strange, because the events of those days occupied an experience, a duration far longer than their calendar reality. The way that crisis compresses and expands time simultaneously were the worst that Valdric had known since the years immediately after his turning, when the world had been entirely new and entirely terrifying, and the only resource available to him was forward motion. He moved forward. He had always moved forward. The investigation expanded. With Marta Voss's analysis as a theoretical anchor, the investigation team developed new methods for detecting the signature of memory transit in individuals who were being fed from a biochemical trace, something produced by the specific cognitive process the memory feeders initiated, that was present in both the human contacts and, upon careful testing, in several members of the underground. The testing was voluntary but nearly universal. When the community understood what was at stake, it cooperated with the characteristic pragmatism of people who have been surviving difficult things for a very long time. The results were both worse and better than expected. Worse because the number of individuals showing signs of active memory depletion was higher than the investigation team had projected, not just in the affected districts of the city above, but throughout the underground, where the density of proximity meant that even individuals who had had no direct contact with identified memory feeders were showing trace evidence of the process. Better, because the depletion in most cases was extremely low level, a slow draw rather than an aggressive extraction, suggesting that the transit system, if that is what it was, had capacity constraints that were limiting the rate. The identified memory feeders were 8 in number, which was more than Valdric had expected. They were distributed across 4 different bloodlines, spanning an age range from approximately 80 years to over 300. They were not, he noted, among the underground's most senior members or its most powerful. They were middle figures, significant but not central, respected but not indispensable. The kind of people in any community who do their work well and are not thought about very much. He thought about this distribution. He thought about the possibility that it was deliberate, that whatever process had activated these, individuals had chosen them precisely because their middle position would ensure their invisibility within the community hierarchy. Powerful members would be watched too closely. Peripheral members would have too little access. The middle figures, with their blend of access and unremarkability, were perfect, which implied selection, which implied intention, which implied that the origin of this process was not random evolutionary pressure, but directed action, not a mutation that had happened to the underground, but a change that had been designed and introduced, and was now operating according to a plan. The 1917 visit, the unnamed member, the first records of unexplained forgetting in the year immediately following. A seed, planted over a century ago, germinating slowly through the underground's own adaptive machinery. The underground had been carrying this capacity for 100 years, had been cultivating it unknowingly through its own practices, its own ecology, its own particular way of existing, and all of that time, something had been waiting. Something had been patient in the way that very old things learn to be patient, because time is not a constraint when you have had enough of it. He brought this analysis to the council. Sevi listened to it with her characteristic stillness, and then she said something that he had not expected. She said that the council had been discussing a theory, and that his analysis was consistent with it, and that she wanted to tell him what the theory was before he heard it from anyone else, which was a form of courtesy that he appreciated. The theory was that the memory feeders were not the entity, they were the method. The entity, whatever it was that had sent an unnamed member through the underground in 1917 and planted a capacity that had been slowly growing ever since, was not present in the city. It was not present in the underground. It was somewhere else, somewhere at the other end of the transit. And the transit had been running for 100 years, gathering momentum, and was now, for reasons unknown but suspected to be related to some threshold of accumulated volume or some change in external conditions, running at a rate that was producing visible effects. Valdric asked the obvious question, where was it? Sethi said they did not know, but they had a suggestion of direction. The oldest of the underground's mine workers, a woman named Karita, who had been practicing the inner craft for over 3 centuries, and whose understanding of the cognitive substrate was as complete as anyone's alive, had spent a week attempting to trace the transit signal using techniques she had developed herself over the course of that week specifically for this purpose. She had not been able to follow the signal to its destination, but she had been able to determine, with what she described as reasonable confidence, that the signal moved in a direction that was not lateral but temporal, not across space but across time. The memories were not being sent to a place. They were being sent to a when. There was a tradition in the underground, one of the oldest traditions the community maintained, that had no formal name and no documented origin, but that was practiced with such consistency that it was one of the background certainties of underground life, one of those practices so ordinary that numbers no longer notice them, the way the constant inhabitants of a place stop noticing its particular smell. Every 10 years, on a night in midwinter, the community gathered in the largest of the great halls for what was simply called the remembering. It was not a ceremony in any formal religious sense. There was no officiating, no prescribed ritual, no text that was read or spoken. Members simply gathered, and the oldest members present spoke aloud about things they remembered. Specific memories, not generalizations, specific sensory recollections of specific moments from centuries of accumulated experience. The voice of a person gone for 200 years. The smell of a coast they had left and never returned to. The particular quality of light in a city that no longer existed. The feeling of a winter that had been especially cold, experienced in a body that did not feel cold in the ordinary sense, but that could detect it and remember it with perfect fidelity. These memories were not offered as lessons. They were not offered as entertainment or as the communal assertion of shared history, though they served those functions. They were offered as themselves, as the irreducible fact of a specific experience that had been had by a specific being, and was now held and shared, and would continue to be held and shared into a future that was, by the nature of their existence, very long. The remembering was the community's answer to the fundamental problem of immortality, which was not death, but drift. The problem that Valdric had been thinking about for weeks now, in the context of what was being lost, that over long enough timescales, even perfect memory becomes detached from the continuity that gives it meaning, that a sequence of perfectly preserved moments is not the same as a life unless something holds the sequence together, gives it narrative coherence, makes it a through line rather than an archive. The remembering held the sequence together. Shared memory made shared meaning. The community had understood this for centuries without putting it in those terms, had built a practice around it that was not explicitly a solution to the problem of immortality's loneliness, but that functioned as one nonetheless. Valdric had been attending the remembering for over 2 centuries. He had been thinking, in recent weeks, about what the remembering would look like, what it would feel like, what it would mean in a community that was being drained of its memories. Not quickly, not catastrophically, but slowly, steadily. The richest and most identity-dense memories going first, the high emotional weight material that Marta Voss had identified as the feeder's preferred target. He thought about a remembering where the oldest member stood up to speak and found, in the place where a specific memory had been, a gap. A smooth place in the architecture of recall, where something had been and was no longer. Not the natural attrition of very long time, that had a different quality, a kind of soft fading, but an absence that had edges. A clean removal. He thought about the community losing not just its records, but its voice, its capacity to remember itself to itself. He thought about what a civilization was when its memory was gone. Carita's analysis of the temporal direction of the transit occupied 6 days of intensive work that she conducted essentially without sleep, sustained by a kind of focused urgency that Valdric recognized because he had felt it himself, the urgency that comes when you have found the right problem and know that time, which is usually irrelevant to people like you, is suddenly and specifically relevant in a way that cannot be managed by waiting. What she found, and what she explained to Valdric in a room that she had sealed against any possible monitoring, precaution that neither of them felt was excessive, was this: the transit was not simply temporal. It was not moving memories from the present to some fixed point in the past. It was moving memories toward a source, toward the originating point of the capacity that was now active in the underground's memory feeders, toward whatever had created the mechanism that had been planted in 1917. And that source was not in the past in the way that a historical event is in the past, bounded, finished, causally disconnected from the present. It was in the past in the way that a deep underground river is underground, present beneath the surface, connected to the surface by channels that allow flow in both directions, reachable if you knew where the channels were and what moved through them. The source was old, older than the underground, older than any vampire civilization she had records of. Older, she said carefully, than the history they had access to. Something that had been accumulating memory for so long that it had passed through the other side of the concept entirely. Something that was not a mind in any ordinary sense, but that contained so much accumulated cognition that the word mind was as inadequate a description as the word river is for the ocean. Something that had learned in its great antiquity that there was only one truly renewable resource in the universe. Not blood, not life, not the physical substrate of any mortal or immortal being, memory, the ongoing production of new experience by beings who kept generating it. Consciousness feeding unconsciousness. Not destructively, not immediately. It took from its sources slowly enough that they continued to generate, turned them into farms rather than consumed them as livestock. Carita said she believed it had been doing this for as long as there had been beings capable of generating the kind of memory it fed on, which was a very long time. She said she believed the underground's community had been identified as a particularly valuable source, not because they were powerful or dangerous, but because they were old. Old and continuous. Because they generated memory over timescales that no human population could match. Because the density of accumulated self in a 600-year-old vampire was orders of magnitude greater than in the oldest human, and the memory feeders had been positioned precisely where that density was highest. She said she believed the trigger for the acceleration, the reason the transit had ramped up to visible levels now, after a century of slow operation, was that the source was hungry. That something about its circumstances had changed in a way that increased its need, and it was drawing faster from its farms, and the drawing was now fast enough to produce the visible effects in the city above and the empty compartments below. Valdric asked what they could do. Carita was quiet for a long time. Then she said there were 3 possibilities. First, they could do nothing, accept the transit as the cost of their continued existence, and trust that the source would not draw fast enough to destroy them, that it would maintain the equilibrium that had apparently served it for at least a century. The risk of this option was that the current acceleration might represent a permanent shift rather than a temporary spike, in which case the equilibrium was already gone. Second, they could attempt to sever the transit, to identify the channels through which it operated and close them, using techniques that Carita was not certain existed, but that she believed could be developed from the principles of the inner craft. The risk of this option was that severing a channel of that antiquity might have consequences that could not be predicted, and that the source might respond to severance in ways that were worse than the slow drain. Third, and she said this with the particular hesitation of someone presenting an option they find both compelling and terrifying, they could attempt contact. They could try to reach through the transit, to speak to whatever was at the other end of it, to enter into some form of negotiation or understanding with something that had been, treating them as a resource without their knowledge or consent. The risk of the third option was the most obvious of all, that you do not negotiate from a position of strength with something that is older than history, that has already demonstrated both the patience and the capacity to treat your civilization as a silent farm for 100 years without your awareness, and that could presumably, if it chose, draw faster than even the current acceleration. The risk of the third option was that you might succeed, and that success might mean something entirely different from what you hoped. There is a moment in any truly long existence when you arrive at a precipice that has no name. Not the precipice of death, which had been present throughout Valdric's life, and had ceased to frighten him the way it once had. Not the precipice of transformation, which he had crossed once 6 centuries ago, and which had been frightening in the way that all crossings of irreversible thresholds are frightening. This was a different kind of precipice. The kind that arrives when you have followed a chain of understanding to its end, when you have allowed the implications of what you know to fully unfold, and you find yourself looking at a reality that is so much larger than the frame you had been operating in, that the frame itself seems, in retrospect, like a child's drawing of a room. He had spent 6 centuries in the underground and above it, moving through the intricate machinery of a civilization that had survived by being careful, by being small, by being precise and invisible and patient. He had invested 400 years in this particular form of continuation. He had watched it be built and rebuilt, had participated in its construction, had given what might otherwise have been a very different kind of life to the work of making it last. And it had been, all along, a farm. Not necessarily a bad thing. He tried, with the intellectual honesty he had always prized, to hold both things simultaneously, the violation of it and the neutrality of it. The source had not, as best as anyone could determine, intended their destruction. A farmer does not destroy the soil. A farmer tends it, manages it, takes from it carefully enough that it continues to generate. For 100 years, the taking had been careful. The community had continued. The taking had accelerated now, and that was a problem, but the problem was one of rate rather than kind. But knowing you are a farm was not the same as being a farm in ignorance. Knowledge changed the thing. It changed the relationship between the knower and the known. It changed what was possible and what was intolerable. He thought about the third option. He thought about it for a long time. What Karita had described, the source, the transit, the ancient accumulation of other beings' experience, was the most frightening thing he had encountered in 6 centuries, and the most fascinating, and both of those responses were, he recognized, appropriate. Both were honest. He was afraid of it. He was also drawn toward it with the specific gravity that comes when you encounter something that is, in its strangeness, the answer to a question you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. He had spent 6 centuries accumulating his own experience, building the vast internal archive that constituted his self, and he had always known, with the quiet certainty that never quite found its way into explicit thought, that the accumulation was for something, that there was a reason to keep adding to it rather than simply existing within it, that the forward motion of experience served some purpose beyond the automatic continuation of being alive. He had never been able to name that purpose. He had simply trusted it, the way you trust a direction of travel before you know where it leads. He thought about a being so old that its accumulation of others' memories had passed through the far side of individual consciousness into something else. Something that could not be a self in the ordinary sense, that was too large for selfhood, too dispersed through too many other selves to have a center of its own, and yet that was not simply storage. Not an archive. Something active, something that was still, after however many millions of years, continuing to accumulate. Something that had not stopped reaching. Something that was still hungry. He thought about hunger. He thought about the fact that the memory feeders of the underground did not seem to know they were doing it, had not, in any of the interviews conducted by the investigation team, demonstrated conscious awareness of their role in the transit system. They were not agents. They were receptors, passive channels through which the drawing happened. The capacity had been placed in them, and it operated through them the way a plant operates toward sunlight, not through choice, but through nature, through the alignment of what the organism was with what the environment provided. But Karita had said there were channels, and channels, unlike passive processes, had directions that could be changed. The council authorized the third option by a majority of 1, with 2 abstentions. The abstentions were Sethas and Marates. Both of them made clear, before the vote was taken, that their abstentions were not expressions of opposition but of acknowledgement that the decision was beyond the council's normal scope, that whatever they were attempting to do was sufficiently unprecedented that the concept of authorization itself was almost meaningless. They were not deciding to take an action. They were deciding to attempt one. The distinction mattered. Karita led the preparation with the calm focus of someone who has moved fully past fear into the clarity that lives on the other side of it. She worked for 3 weeks, developing the techniques that did not yet exist, drawing on her 3 centuries of inner craft practice to construct something that was, she was honest about this, largely theoretical until it was attempted. She worked with a team of 7, 6 of the underground's most skilled mind workers, selected for the specific quality of their practice rather than their seniority, and Marta Voss, whose role was to serve as the diagnostic anchor, the observer who could monitor the cognitive effects of the attempt in real time, because Marta Voss was the only person in the room who was already in receipt of the transit's output and could therefore detect whether the attempt was producing any response. Valdric was not on the team. He had asked to be, and Karita had refused with a directness that he respected. She said his accumulated memory made him the most valuable thing in the room and the most dangerous thing to risk. She said that if what they were attempting worked and the source was alerted to the attempt, the first response would likely be to draw harder on its nearest high-density sources, and she did not want him in the channel when that happened. He accepted this. He waited outside the sealed chamber in the amber-lit corridor, and he thought about the fog. The fog that had been wrong. The fog that had started all of this 8 months ago with its missing smell. He had been standing on the seawall, and something in his ancient blood had told him that something was wrong. And he had trusted that feeling, and the months since had been the slow, difficult business of finding out what wrong meant. He did not know, standing in the corridor, whether what was happening in the sealed chamber would work. He did not know whether contact was even possible, or whether possible contact was the same as meaningful contact, or whether meaningful contact with something of that antiquity and scale was something that had any outcome useful to the beings attempting it. He did not know whether the underground would survive this in any form he would recognize. He knew that the underground had survived 400 years of not being destroyed by things that were external to it. He was less certain about survival in the face of things that were internal, because internal threats had a different character. They did not arrive as opposition, but as revelation, as the discovery that the thing you were and the thing threatening you were made of the same material, that the predator was part of the prey. He stood in the corridor, and he thought about the remembering, about the community gathered in the great hall, speaking specific memories aloud to each other, holding the sequence together. He thought about what it would mean to speak a memory to something that had been collecting memories for as long as the concept of memory had existed, whether there was any language adequate to that kind of address, whether address was even the right concept. He thought about the possibility, and he held it as a possibility rather than a certainty, because 6 centuries had taught him to be precise about the difference, that the source was not indifferent, that something accumulating the interior lives of conscious beings for that long was not doing so out of nothing, that it had, in its great incomprehensible antiquity, the inverse of what the underground had built the remembering to combat, not the drift of individual experience from collective meaning, but the opposite. An accumulation so vast that individual meaning had somewhere become collective in a way that could not be undone. All those memories, all those selves, not stored, not archived, but in some form he could not name without better understanding what the source was, still somehow present. Still somewhere, in the depths of something enormous and patient and older than the oldest thing he knew, continuing. The sealed chamber door opened. Karita came out first. She was followed by the 6 mindworkers, and last by Marta Voss. Valdric looked at their faces, and his ancient skill at reading faces told him before any of them spoke that something had happened, and that what had happened was not what any of them had expected, and that none of them had been harmed. Karita sat down on the stone floor of the corridor with the direct practicality of someone whose legs have decided that sitting is what happens next. The mind workers arranged themselves in various postures that suggested they were processing something large. Marta Voss stood against the wall, and her expression was the one she had worn the first time she came to the underground, clear and steady, and looking at something that wasn't quite there. What Karita described, carefully and at length, was contact. Not the kind of contact they had prepared for. Not the confrontational or negotiatory engagement that the third option had been conceptualized as. What had happened was more like she searched for an analogy and settled on one she said was inadequate, but was the best available. What had happened was more like becoming briefly readable to something that had always been reading in the vicinity, like coming into legibility. Not the source attending to them, but them becoming visible to something that had been there all along. What they had felt, all 7 of them, and Marta Voss differently but in the same direction, was the specific quality of being perceived, not as prey, not as resource. And here Karita paused for a long time, and when she continued, her voice had the careful quality of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than comfort, as entries. As new additions to something that already contained an enormous number of entries, that had been adding entries for an enormous amount of time, that was engaged in an act of accumulation that was not predation in any moral sense, but that was nonetheless not a relationship of equals and could not pretend to be. The acceleration, the increased rate of drawing that had produced the visible effects had stopped. Not because they had demanded it, not because they had negotiated. It had stopped because the source had become aware, through the contact, that its drawing was producing distress in its sources, and distress was not something a farmer wanted in the crop. The calculus was not moral but practical. A damaged source generates less. The source had not known the drawing was producing distress. It had not been monitoring at the resolution required to detect distress. Now it was. Marta Voss, who had been the clearest receiver of the transit's output throughout this process, said only one thing. She said that in the moment of contact, among the foreign memories she had been accumulating for months, she had felt one that was older than any of the others, much older. Older than old in the way that geological features are old, the way the bedrock under the city was old, and it had not been taken from anyone. It had been, and she said this with the scientist's precision, and the awareness that the precision was failing the thing she was trying to describe, offered. She could not describe what it had shown her. She said the architecture of the content was beyond her cognitive vocabulary. She said that the closest she could come was, it was a memory of what memory was for. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Eventually, Valdric helped Karita to her feet, and the group made its way back through the amber-lit corridors of the underground, past the Hall of Records and the sealed compartments, and the great halls where the communities, centuries of accumulated effort, had left their marks in stone and glass and careful preservation, back toward the ordinary ongoing life of a civilization that was still there, still continuing, changed in ways that none of them could yet fully articulate. The weeks after the contact were the strange quiet of aftermath. Not resolution. Valdric had been alive long enough to distrust resolution as a concept, knowing that endings were always also beginnings, and that what felt like a conclusion was usually just a shift in what was visible. The situation had not been resolved. The source was still there. The transit was still there, operating now at the low, sustainable rate that Karita believed had been its original design, the rate of a century ago, before whatever change had triggered the acceleration. The memory feeders were still in the community, no longer drawing at the accelerated rate, though whether they were drawing at any rate and whether they could stop, or whether stopping was something the capacity permitted, remained unclear. The 3 empty compartments in the Hall of Records remained empty. The memories they had contained did not come back, and Valdric had spent some time thinking about whether they would, whether the transit was one-directional, whether what had been taken could be returned, or whether it was gone in the way that spoken words are gone, present in the air, and then not. He thought about the remembering. The next one was in midwinter, still months away. He had decided that he would speak at it, which he had not done in several years, and that what he would speak about was specific. He had chosen the memory carefully, the way you choose words for something that matters. A morning in the 14th century, the harbor where the city would eventually be, the light on the water, a sound he could not name that might have been the particular frequency of a world that existed before any of this. He would speak it aloud into the gathered presence of the community, and it would become shared, and the sharing would make it real in a different way than it had been when it lived only in him. He had thought about offering, in Marta Voss's sense of the word. He had thought about what it would mean to give freely what had been taken without consent. He had thought about the difference between a farm and a partner, and whether that difference was available to him and what it would require. He did not have answers. He had 6 centuries of practice at moving forward without answers, which was not the same thing but was, in the available options, as close as you could get. The city above continued. The fog came in from the Atlantic on the nights that were cold enough, and it no longer smelled wrong. The people in the 3 affected districts were slowly recovering, the way minds do when the pressure on them is reduced. Not perfectly, not completely, some things gone for good, but the direction was toward mending. The rate of disturbance in the surface world was declining and would continue to decline, and eventually there would be no visible sign that anything had happened. Valdric stood on the seawall on the last night of November, the fog coming in, and he looked at the harbor and he thought about continuity, about what it took to last. Not just in the biological sense, not just the management of the body and the feeding and the invisibility, but in the deeper sense. The sense that had been threatened and had survived. The sense of being a self that remembered itself, that held its own history with both hands, that did not allow the accumulation of experience to become so vast and undifferentiated that the self at the center lost its edges. He thought about something very old and about what it might mean to be that old, to have been accumulating for that long, and whether there was still a self at the center or whether the center had, somewhere in the vast span of that existence, dissolved into the accumulation. Whether what Marta Voss had received, the thing she could not describe, the memory of what memory was for, was a communication from a self or from something that had been a self once and was now something else. Something still conscious, still reaching, but differently than any of them could fully understand. He thought about grief again. Not the grief of loss, though that was still present, for the records that would not come back, for the months of disruption in the city, for the community's collective sense of safety that had been damaged and would take time to repair. He felt also something that he had not expected to feel, which was a grief that was not exactly grief, a feeling in the vicinity of grief that had some other quality, some admixture of recognition or kinship, or the specific sadness of understanding something at a great distance that you cannot reach. He thought about the memory of what memory was for. He thought, perhaps it is for this. For standing in the dark with the fog coming in and feeling what you feel and not turning away from it. For holding the experience and letting it become part of you, another layer in the archive, another entry in the accumulation that you carry forward. For being a self that persists not despite its vulnerability to loss, but through it. For being alive enough to be hurt. For being old enough to know that being hurt is not the end. For remembering. The fog moved in from the sea and wrapped the city in its familiar gray. The street lamps became halos. The harbor went invisible. Somewhere beneath him, 600 years of accumulated experience settled into the stone like water settling into its level, patient and specific and entirely itself. He was still there. He had always been still there. The fog closed over the seawall, and the city disappeared into it, and the night came fully in from the Atlantic, and there was only the sound of the water below, and the cold, and the dark, and the long, continuous act of being alive that had always been, and always would be, both the burden and the gift of something that had learned to last. And in the deep silence of the underground, in the sealed compartments of volcanic glass, in the amber light of lamps that had been burning for generations, the records that remained held the shape of everything that had been and was and would continue to be, as long as there was someone to hold them, as long as there was something in the dark worth remembering, as long as the keeping of memory was itself a form of life. The fog did not clear before morning. It never did.